Hello, welcome to this ninth webinar in the Future of Research webinar series. And today this session is all about data expectations and joining the data dots. Now, with the advent of GDPR, customers do seem to be more happy sharing their data, particularly when they know they will get something in return or it'll make life easier or better for them. However, this positive mindset shift comes with a series of expectations because we know that customers are more savvy, more fickle and more promiscuous than ever. And businesses are under increasing pressure to deliver financial returns. So customer experience encompasses a plethora of touch points, and we need to use data from that alongside other business information and KPIs in order to provide a model of interlinked performance. I'm going to hand over now to my colleagues Fiona Moss and Jamie Thorpe, who are going to take us through the session today. Over to you, Jamie.
Perfect, thank you, Pippa. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can hear and you can see me okay. For those I don't know, my name is Jamie Thorpe. I'm Head of Experience Management at Ipsos. I've spent 24 years working with clients to develop, implement and evolve their customer experience programs. So the introduction from Pippa today perfectly fits with my experience and what we're doing here at Ipsos. It's great to be here talking to you about joining the data dots. I know that to some this might not be seen as the sexy end of CX, but actually to some it is, but it's critically important, and when done properly, it's an absolute game changer. So we're going to spend the next 25-30 minutes talking through that with you. As Pippa said, we do encourage questions, so please do share. I'm really pleased to be joined by Fiona Moss, who's going to take us through some practical applications of bringing the data dots together. So Fiona, hello, hi, can I just ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, yep, thanks Jamie, and hello everyone. As Jamie said, my name's Fiona Moss. I'm team lead for our global customer experience analytics team. So we spend a lot of our time helping our clients understand what's most important in their customer experience, helping them to better understand their customers, and also helping drive sort of more desirable customer behaviours. So things like increasing spend and decreasing churn. And I'm really happy to be here today to talk about how we can pull together different data sources to deliver on some of those objectives.
Perfect, thanks Fiona. So without any further ado, let's push on. So I mean, the first question, if you like, is why should brands bother go to the effort of joining the data dots? Why take the trouble? Well, actually using data effectively, serving customers in context, or even preempting their needs will improve their experience, and improved experience will deliver significant results. We know that when CX is delivered properly, there is a financial gain to be had, and you can see that on the slide here, and there are various stats that are published on this, but we know that people will pay more for a better experience. We see it ourselves. People on the call here know that consumers, if they're going to receive a better experience, they're willing to pay more for it. In some cases that's up to 20-25% more. So in this day and age, in this current climate, with everything that's going on, if ever there was a WTF moment, then absolutely this is it. If you can deliver a better experience by bringing data dots together, people will pay more for it. We know history has shown us that the people that focus, or the brands or CX leaders that focus on CX during tough times such as this, will be those that come out as the winners. We saw a piece of research that was published earlier in the year that showed that during the 2008-2009 credit crunch, those brands who focused on CX delivered a 3 times return to their shareholders than those that didn't. So really, the why bother, why go to the effort is that it is a game changer when it comes to financial performance. So the aim, therefore, is surely to be good at customer experience, right? I mean, that's what surely everybody is here to do. But actually, it's wrong, because sadly, just being good is no longer good enough. And you can see on the slide here, this is something that I've said, but it is, there are variations on it, but it's certainly something I believe that it's true, that it's not digitization or disruption that brands should fear. It's being average, it's mediocrity that will drive customers away. And there are numerous examples of people who are leading in CX, and those businesses that are being blamed for killing other businesses, but it's not that. It's the failure of some to evolve, the failure of some just being completely average that's driving customers away and that's seeing them fail. Customer experience can be the difference between success and failure. There are some, I want to share a personal favorite example of mine, and that is the auto brand Lexus. So I ran their CX program for a number of years. They were top of their JD Power ranking for 12 years. And they had a mindset that brought in relevance to what we're doing here, taking a very holistic view of the customer, bringing the data dots together, but also being so far away from mediocre, it's untrue. They had a survey after you had an interaction with them that had 3 questions. And the first question was, were you completely satisfied, yes or no? There's no middle ground to that. So they were driving high levels of customer experience excellence. And then they were taking the data dots, bringing them all together and serving the customers in context to drive that experience. And those are the reasons that they were so good at what they were doing and why they led the way for so long. But the consistency is key in that. You have to make sure that you're delivering that experience consistently well, because we know, as Pippa said in her introduction at the start, customers are more savvy, more fickle, more promiscuous, and that promiscuity is what is really interesting at the moment. We see from our research that we know that customers will leave a brand that they love after one bad experience. So that's not true everywhere, but in most cases where they have a bad experience, if they love the brand, they will still move on. That promiscuity is a challenge for many organizations. This is obviously compounded by the ecosystem that we see the customers are in. We're all customers, we know this. We're bombarded with marketing messages all the time, and these things are evolving at pace as people around, as businesses around us get smarter in terms of how they use their data, how things like Alexa are using the information that they hold on us, how the brands are using personalization, targeting, and prediction. So the customer is operating in a very busy, very noisy ecosystem. This makes it even more important for us to make sure that we connect with them and we get that emotional connectivity. And we'll talk a bit about that a little bit later on. But as my colleagues in behavioral science would tell you, that sometimes it means in this ecosystem, customers just need a little nudge every now and again. And those businesses that win with customers are those understand the needs and that meet them through action, which is something that Fiona is going to take us through now.
Thanks for that, Jamie. So I think what Jamie's really just said to us is that, customer needs are evolving, and successful businesses will be those businesses that respond to them the best and keep up with that evolution. So what I'd like to do very briefly is consider 3 use cases where we can involve multiple data sources to try and respond to that objective and help our businesses to act. So the first use case is really the most obvious, and it's also as old as customer research itself. It is that we can and we should be using multiple data sources to understand what our customer needs are, because if we don't know what those needs are, we can't meet them. And then also we should be tracking our performance against those needs. So staying in the realm of traditional research very briefly, Qual is of course a brilliant go-to for unearthing customer needs. Quant can also give us great insight into what customer needs are, and also crucially allow us to sort of track our performance there really robustly. But increasingly unstructured data is really useful here. So I don't just mean survey open ends, but I also mean things like text analytics of social media data, of emails, of call transcripts, of chatbot transcripts. All of that information can give us incredible insight into customer needs as they evolve, as well as telling us how our customers perceive we are at addressing them. And then, of course, there are other data sources as well, things like complaints volumes and whether or not they're going up or down, which can be hugely useful here. Now, I'm sure a lot of that is very familiar to lots of you listening, so I'm not going to dwell on that point. Some of you may be wondering why I haven't called out the customer experience KPI as a brilliant indicator of how well we're meeting customer needs. And to that, I would say it definitely is, but only, apologies, only if it measures what we think it's measuring. And I really say this because I think, 10, 15 years ago, there was some really healthy debate about what went into a good KPI. That debate's coming back again a little bit at the moment. But in the intervening period, as an industry, we really tended to settle into a convention. And of course, with convention comes the risk that the KPI that we're using may not link to our customer experience and our customer needs quite in the way that we would hope it would. So checking that link doesn't have to be anything complex. It can be as simple as doing something like looking at your broader customer experience and running correlations or a driver analysis between that and your KPI. But it gives you that reassurance that your KPI is doing what you think it is. And therefore, if your KPI starts to drop, that is, of course, a compelling call to action for your business to do something because you're no longer delivering the customer experience in the way that you would wish to. My final point on this slide is also about the KPI, and it's that we now want our KPIs to reflect the organization's bottom line. So this is really something that's grown in popularity over the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, and it may in part be responsible for the sort of renewed conversation we're seeing around good KPIs. But essentially, it's no longer enough for a KPI just to tell us whether or not we're meeting customer needs. We also want it to be telling us whether or not we're doing that profitably. And I have an example of this on my next slide. So this is some work that we did for a North American bank, and it's an example of ROCXI, or Return on Customer Experience Investment Analysis. So the bank came to us asking for evidence of two things. So first of all, they wanted to be sure that as their KPI improved, so too would their real life customer value. The second piece of evidence they wanted was some kind of indicator as to whether or not, which aspect of their customer experience they should be improving first in order to get the best returns on their investment. So what we did was we explored the link between the KPI and customer value, and we found a really nice positive relationship there. And then we built a simulator for the Insight team, which allowed them to play around with different improvement levels in different aspects of the customer experience and see what kind of impact that would have on their KPI and also on the financial returns that they might expect. So I've got a high level view of that here. If they were to improve all of their customer experience metrics by 10%, that would lead to a 9-point increase in their KPI, a 2.8% increase in average customer value, and finally, almost $73 million in terms of total financial return. So certainly compelling evidence there that it's worth investing in understanding and meeting customer needs. But I'm now going to hand you back to Jamie, who's got some more examples for us.
Perfect, thanks, Fiona. So the business impact, the business end, if you like, here is undeniable. So when you think about talking about return on investment, and we often talk about it, we get asked a lot about it in the CX programs that we're running, especially now at the moment. As Fiona showing you there through that example, the impact is huge. And show me a C-suite or a CEO that isn't interested in an incremental sales increase without increasing staff costs using data that they've already got. So we've got a couple of other examples here that I just want to talk through. I've got 4 on this slide. I'm not going to talk through them all. I'm just going to talk through a couple now. So my favorite here is one actually that's in the top left, and I know Apple get held up as an exemplar quite regularly, and there's good reasons for that, so I make no apologies for doing so again here. But they attribute $30 million incremental revenue per year to store managers spending 1 hour a week closing the loop with customers. And that is obviously a leading behavior when it comes to CX operational programs, so closing the loop, going back to customers who've had a poor experience. But what's really, really important and why it's really relevant here is that they've created that culture within the organization, and they bring all of the data together and serve it to the store manager to enable them to act on it. They're spending no additional money, there's no additional time or effort. But what they're doing is they're bringing that and they're putting it in the hands of the store manager, who sits down once a week as part of their BAU, as part of their drumbeat, part of how they do things, and they close the loop with customers. Sorry you had this experience, sorry we couldn't help you there, how can we make it better, how can we sort it? And that's an additional $30 million a year, which, as you can see, is very impressive. The other example I want to share with you is in the top right, and this is around automotive. So for an automotive client, we proved that a 1% improvement in their NPS is worth £120 million a year in incremental revenue. So the business end is really, really important, and the impact that it can have on the business, as I mentioned earlier, about the fine margins between success and failure, can be seen in real money examples here from CX. However, obviously we recognise that ROCXI focuses on the commercials, but the softer side of customer experience and how you can use data to drive engagement with customers is critical. I mentioned it right up front, and what you can see here is some examples of emotional attachment. So this is from some Ipsos research, where we're thinking with sort of brand preference as the end game. Brands want to be the first in mind when a customer thinks about their service, their product, their goods. And what we're showing here is back to that mediocrity point that I made earlier. We have a lot of research that talks about the company effort and the customer effort. And if the customer feels that they're putting in more effort than the company is, then the ratio is misaligned and we find dissatisfaction follows. But what you can see here are preference scores attached to the smiley faces or otherwise here, and the difference between where people are merely functionally satisfied. And we've got to remember that CX is underwritten by a transaction of some shape or form. And there is a functional satisfaction that's in there, but actually that's being good. And as I said earlier, that's not good enough. That emotional connectivity, you can see those people who are emotionally connected to or attached to brands see twice the preference scores of where we're merely functionally satisfied. So brands have got to be aiming high when they think about that connectivity and make sure that they're impacting satisfaction, loyalty, and advocacy through emotional attachments. And we see some halo effects in that, and we all know about the John Lewis effect and those sorts of businesses. But think about, I would encourage people to think about this when they think, how do they use the data? How do they connect with customers, and what business impact does it have? There's another stat that sits behind this. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but there's a 306% increase in customer lifetime value when people are sitting in this top right rather than sitting in the middle. So again, although softer side, there is clearly a financial gain to be had there as well. Pippa mentioned this earlier in her introduction, the advent of GDPR, and actually what that means. And what we've seen is the give-get balance, if you like, has shifted. Customers are now much more aware of their value to brands, which has changed how they think, how they act. We all remember the days, well, maybe some of us, most of us do, if you're as old as me, remember the days where brands were climbing over themselves to get customer information. How can I get this customer information? And then how do I then do something with it? Well, now they've got more than ever before. Then we see a change in the customer mindset, because GDPR opened up the way in which we share data, and where we may have been much more cautious before, we're now much more comfortable. What's interesting is that shift in the dynamic when you think about how data is used, as you can see on the slide here, a representation that indicates as customers share more personal information, their expectation is they will get better experiences from it. And that as I said, that dynamic between the brand and the customer is there, and that expectation is there also. We've seen some very, very distinctly high levels of dissatisfaction where customers are saying, well, brands know this about me. They know what I do. They know what I spend. They know how, my demographics, and they're not using this to drive a better experience. So the WAMP has turned a little bit when it comes to personal information and better experience. So we've got really what I describe here as a bit of a perfect storm, because we say brands with customer data in their hands, and surely they know how to use it effectively. Well, interestingly, when you look at the three stats that I've got on my rather creative road signs here, you can see that actually this is perfect storm, because 95% of businesses are confident that they can identify their customers. As you've seen on the previous slide, customers are willing to provide more personal information, but for that perceived value, and in this instance, it's around a better experience. And 70% of customers are willing to do that. But still more than half of customers don't feel recognized in the ecosystem when they're engaging with the brands. And this is often because they get lost in the machine. So this perfect storm of, yes, we can identify customers. Yes, Mr. or Mrs. Customer is happy to share more information, but they still don't feel recognized, shows that there's a bit of a gap, and it is a version of an experience gap. And we saw this in the recent CX Voices study that we did, where there is a bit of a disconnect between what CX leaders think that they're doing in terms of how successful they've been through COVID. So we asked a question, how successful have you been through COVID? And the question, the answers ranged from not successful at all to very, very successful. And a lot of the CX leaders have put themselves as high on being successful, but there is a disconnect between what customers felt. And Fiona's now, I'm going to hand back to Fiona, who's going to take you through that from an ecosystem point of view. But just would ask you to bear in mind the stats that you can see on the slide here when she does.
So I think we've talked a lot there about the need to meet customer needs, the need to understand them, the need to address them profitably, the need also to address them as they evolve and as they're willing to share more data with us. But the reality of that is that actually, as Jamie has just pointed out, it can be quite challenging to make sense of the data that we've got and potentially any more data that we might collect. So what I'd like to do is just spend a couple of minutes thinking about how we can make sense of the data we have got and how we can maximize it to ensure that customers do feel recognized and valued. And one place to start is by building a data ecosystem. So a data ecosystem is really a way of pulling together the different data sources that we've got based on 4 principles. So the first is that it includes all of the customer data we have. I say that like it's easy. I recognise in the real world it's really actually quite challenging. But if we don't know what data we've got, then it becomes really quite difficult to tease out links between things and to identify gaps. The second principle is that we want to assign a purpose to each of the different data sources that we have in our ecosystem. So to give you an example, what we'd like to do, for example, if you've got a relationship study, you might be tracking your KPI within that, so you know how well you're meeting customer needs. And you might also be tracking high-level performance of your different transactions with your customers. And every now and then you may run some analysis to identify which transactions are most important to your KPI. If you have transactional studies which are aligned with the transactions that you're measuring in your relationship study, then you can turn to those transactional studies for diagnostic information, which actually informs the action plan that you're building around your KPI in your relationship study. So simply by defining the role of the relationship and the transactional studies, you're putting a link between them. The third principle is that we need to know the limits of the data that we are including in our ecosystem. So I don't mean this so much in terms of the data that we're collecting, because we do that at the first point on this slide, but more in terms of how we interpret that data. A good example is chatbot data. So I do quite a lot of work with unstructured data, and one of the things that we've seen is that people really, really like to be rude to robots. So almost always chatbot comment is predominantly negative. And what that means is that we can't take sentiment in chatbot comments as an indicator of how well chatbots are doing their job. And simply by acknowledging that limitation, it indicates to us that actually we need another data source, so something like a follow-up survey that asks the customer if the chatbot resolved their issue, to understand how well the chatbots are performing. The fourth principle is that we need to think about how we can integrate the different data sources within our ecosystem. So when we're setting it up, but also when we're thinking about integrating or adding new data sources to our ecosystem as we go along. And I've got a little bit more about data integration on my next slide. So no session on joining the dots or joining the data dots would be complete without a little bit of geekery. So this is my one and only geeky slide. I'd like to outline a handful of really common data integration approaches here. They range, as you can imagine, from the simple to the complex. So I'll start with the simple and side-by-side analysis. So this is really something we could go away and do this afternoon, all of us, if we wanted to. But side-by-side analysis typically takes a couple of data sets with a timestamp on them, and it tracks them in parallel, looking for convergence and divergence and lead and lag effects. We saw quite a nice example of this fairly recently. We were looking at share of voice in social media of all of the major brands in one particular sector. And we compared that with market share over the same period. And what we found was that movement in share of voice was actually a really powerful lead effect or sort of lead indicator of what was going to happen in terms of real market share a few weeks later. But side-by-side analysis doesn't have to be about timestamps. It can also be simply putting an intuitive link between two studies, so linking the relationship and the transactional studies as I outlined on my previous slide. The next approach we have is data merging, and I think this is probably what we all most commonly think of when we think about integrating data sets. So it typically involves a unique identifier. So in the customer experience space, that more often than not is a unique customer ID. And we merge the data sets based on those unique IDs. So if we have a data set A with customer 1 in and a data set B with customer 1 in, we join the data sets, securing the knowledge that all of the information about customer 1 is all about the same customer. A very similar principle is unit level merging, but this is a sort of slightly higher or more aggregate level unit. So it's typically used in retail, and we might have store level satisfaction, say, and also store level sales and store level footfall. And we can unite or link together all three of those data sets using the store name as a unique identifier. So it's a slightly more macro level than the customer ID in the basic merging. The final approach here we have is data fusion. So this is by far the most complex approach on this slide. The term is used quite loosely. So just for the avoidance of any sort of confusion, I'm talking here about joining together two data sets which perhaps don't contain any of the same customers, or perhaps contain a handful of the same customers, but we don't know. We're not sure. There's no real way of checking, and there's no other way of joining the data sets. So data fusion, well, there are lots of different techniques, first of all, for data fusion, but they're all broadly based on the same principle, that we profile customers in the two data sets that we want to join, and then we match them based on the most closely aligned profiles. What that enables us to do is to pull together two data sets which would otherwise remain separate to give us a much better, more holistic understanding of our customers. But as I'm sure you can see, that join is not as reliable, say, as a merge on a unique customer ID. So we do always urge a little bit of caution with fused data sets, just in terms of what kind of onwards analysis you might want to do with them. And for that reason, we also always recommend, if you're introducing a new data set into your ecosystem, that you include a unique customer ID so that you can do basic level merging rather than relying on data fusion, because it's incredibly powerful, but it does have some limitations. Anyway, I could talk about that all day. I'm going to stop myself there, and I'm going to hand you back to Jamie, who is going to tell us what all of this means.
Perfect, thanks, Fiona. I think it's interesting when you talk about the bringing the data sets together there and saying how we see from where we're sat. It's easy for us to say. I completely agree. I do think though, when we look across the brands with whom we're working, the businesses are waking up to this. They're recognizing the data silos need to be reduced. They need to be removed. So we are seeing it. It's not just us preaching it. We're seeing people actually working on that and actually making it happen within the organizations that we're working with. So that's a good thing. You know, it's a brave new world. I think if ever there was an understatement, it's certainly that. It's a mad world at the moment. Things are changing at pace, but all we can do is we can embrace it. We need to make sure that we are ahead of the curve when it comes to customer expectations, especially as we continue through an overused term, these challenging times. You may have seen these from me before. These are my three customer trends, my customer expectations. They were in place before COVID. They have only been amplified during COVID, and the expectations are changing. And as I said earlier, they're changing very, very quickly. And the level of expectations from customers are rising at such a rapid pace. And my three here are around, the first is know me. So customers want to be known. I've mentioned it already. They want to be served in context. Personalization is no longer reserved for marketing people. From a customer experience point of view, there has to be personalization, bring the data dots together, serve customers in context, because it makes a massive difference. The second is that customers want to be heard. So it is a case of how do we use the survey data? How do we use what's in the public domain, what's in social? What are the channels that you've got as an organization? Bring the silos down, bring the data sets together, but also enable customers to tell you what they think when they think it via channels that are preferred to them. And there, as we know, with the many technological advances and ways in which customers can provide feedback into brands, we need to sweep all that together and make sure that we are not just listening, but we're truly hearing customers. And the third is around value. So value me. And this is not just about financial return. This is about doing something with your insight and the intelligence that you have. So they want to be known, customers want to be heard, and they want to be valued from things like closing the loop, responding to feedback that's been provided, making sure you share in terms of expectations, share customer charters, share as you advance your customer agenda. That shows value, demonstrates value back to the customers, which is what they want to see. Last slide here, which is that basically, in most cases, most CX cases, is actually very simple. People can overcomplicate this massively. And again, people are using different techniques, different ways to bring data together, different channels to get to customers and drive that customer engagement. And I leave you with only this one statement that I see as more and more relevant now with the brands that we're dealing with, is if you don't take care of your customers, somebody else most certainly will.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Fiona. If we could just all switch our cameras on and we'll take the slides off. Yeah. We've got a few questions. I think, you know, there's a lot discussed about infobesity, about having too much data, you know, how do we deal with that data? So it was really, you know, good to see from Fiona, you know, the different ways that we can use different data sources, but also, you know, we have the power at our fingertips to improve things and not to go chasing things which aren't going to have any benefit for a company, which actually might be quite hard to do, but opportunities to identify, you know, sometimes low-hanging fruit to really solve problems, which will have a positive impact on that kind of return on the investment that's being made. So I'm sorry, Fiona, I've got a great question, which is a bit of a mean one. But you shared a case study where you showed some figures about the kind of ongoing effect, and I think you mentioned return on investment, something in the order of 73 or 75 million dollars. How accurate was that?
I thought I might be asked that one. The simple answer in the case of that case study is we don't know yet. So not enough time has elapsed in order for us to be able to tell. And the client hasn't yet achieved the kind of levels of improvement in their customer experience that they were aiming to in order to get the kind of return that they wanted. The more complex answer is that there are some sort of real world variables in that modeling. So we are using real life customer value, and we are controlling for a variety of other sort of metrics. Like I can't go into all of them because they're specific to that client, but things like GDP go in there to try and make it as realistic an estimate as possible. The sad reality for all of us this year, so that piece of analysis was done just on the turn of the year, is that of course the coronavirus has happened, and we just need to turn on the news to understand how difficult all things kind of estimation, prediction, forecasting are at the moment. But certainly under normal circumstances, we would expect it to be a reasonable estimate because of all of the controls that have gone into the model.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and I suppose in a way, the customer interactions are going to be different under the situation we're in. You know, obviously going into another lockdown on Thursday, and it's, you know, perhaps new metrics being brought into a model, which are kind of new dynamics that businesses are using, but critical to at least monitor whether, you know, those are having an impact. More of a general question, but perhaps what makes a good KPI?
Shall I start on that one, Jamie, and then?
Yeah, please do.
All right, okay. So I think I mentioned a couple of things. So I mentioned a good link to meeting customer needs, and also a link to an organisation's bottom line. I think there are some other things that go beyond that as well. So things like simplicity. So we need obviously to make it easy for customers to answer it, because otherwise we're not going to get reliable data. And we also need to make it an easy metric for organisations to understand, because, you know, everybody needs to buy into that KPI. I think what's interesting is that recently there has been a drift towards some conversations about sort of composite KPIs, and whether that should involve an element of, you know, looking at functional needs and whether or not they're met, and also an element of emotional needs and whether or not they're being met as well. And I think there, though, that becomes a very organisation sort of specific decision. So clearly, if as an organisation sort of starting out on its CX journey, actually delivering functional needs might be quite challenging, and adding in that emotional layer at this point might be too much. But for an organisation which is sort of routinely sort of hitting all of its sort of functional needs, and perhaps on the odd occasion when things go wrong, not, but generally it is hitting them, adding that emotional layer can be really, really valuable, because it takes, as sort of Jamie outlined on his chart where he sort of swooped up across a variety of metrics in the middle of the presentation there, it takes the KPI from purely representing the functional to actually representing the sort of the emotional strength that the customer has, or the sort of emotional attachment that the customer has with the brand. I've hogged the limelight a little bit there. Jamie, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great debate, right? The one that we see an awful lot in CX obviously is NPS, and you get that. I mean, most programs have an NPS score. I think I'm much more from the practical operational end of CX. I've mentioned the so what a few times. For me, I don't really care if I were a brand what people say they're going to do. I care what people actually do. And we've got some research, and I can see Fiona's smiling; she knows what's coming. I've shared this before. I've done some research before where we asked customers had they given an NPS score that was a promoter, and then how many actually went on to promote, and the delta was 40%. So for me, when you think some of these massive organizations are making business critical decisions on investment or whatever it might be on an NPS score, you know, I bet the person that's going in isn't saying to the CEO, well, actually there's a delta of plus or minus 40% here. You know, can you imagine that conversation? So for me, you know, the NPS metric, okay, I understand that metrics have a place, that's important, but I'm much more keen, back to your accuracy question, how can I draw a line between what's happened here in CX and what we've actually seen happen from a customer point of view? So how do we measure the impact that it's having? And we're seeing a number of brands do that much more cleverly than ever before. Not to want to avoid the question, I'm not avoiding the question. So NPS is okay. Customer effort, I think, is just continuing to grow. People are just so much, the levels of patience that customers have now, that I want it to be quick, I want it to be easy. I'm a nightmare. If the website doesn't load within 2 or 3 seconds, I'm gone. Okay, so I mean, I'm probably a bad example because my attention span is that of a goldfish, but it is a general truism that I want the journey to be easy. So effort for me is coming through very, very powerfully when we look at a lot of B2C programs. Then of course B2B, NPS doesn't necessarily work. Effort is popular there as well. So in the mix there, I would say effort is coming out very, very strong. NPS has some challenges, but I would always come back to what has the actual impact been and how do I draw a line between what I've done here and what I'm seeing come back through the business.
Yeah, and I mean, you know yourself as a customer, we're all customers ourselves, thinking about those things if someone asked me. And I think I had an experience only a few weeks ago. I was 45 minutes on a phone call before I managed to speak to someone, and you're just boiling, and you're like, well, how can this be? So making sure that you're capturing that real life. And as Fiona, you pointed out in talking about all the different data that be connected, like social media, for example. It's not one thing. Life's a bit more complicated than that, and so this joining of the different dots, bringing them together, understanding how they all interplay, is absolutely vital. I was just going to ask Jamie, with joining the data dots in mind, what do you think the future holds?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we are going to move more towards the predictive and the preemptive. I think this notion of next best action is something. I mentioned my behavioural science colleagues earlier. They do an awful lot of work in the nudging space. So hopefully they're not listening because I will massively undervalue what they're doing here. But in my simple mind, if a customer that follows this sort of profile does that and then does that, they're likely to do this next. And how do we nudge down that path? I think when I see brands use the data effectively, they can see these things coming. And I'm going to see a lot more, I think, in prediction and preemptive and next best action based on the actions they've taken, overlaying the data that they've got. So I think that has to be the future, because we see it in pockets now. You see something happen or come from a brand and it just blows your mind. It just exceeds your expectations straight away. And as I said earlier, I mean, CX isn't, at its most raw, it's not overly complicated. There are a number of, you mentioned earlier, quick wins that could be had. So when you do these things properly and think about how that manifests in an organization, I think that's where we're going to get to. I think next best actions and being predictive and preemptive in terms of engaging customers is going to be big.
I always think of that very human thing, and particularly under lockdown where people are doing a lot of online purchasing. I received something which was a clothing item, and it was wrapped as if it had been wrapped in store, and that was just like, whoa, that was groundbreaking to me. I was like, that is so nice. It had such a big impact, let alone what was in the package. But something particularly under COVID and this kind of very stressful time, that some of those kind of smaller experiences kind of really have a very big impact. We were just going to run till 1:15. So I've got one last question, which is for you, Fiona. You mentioned some caveats when you were talking about the data fusion. How can fused data be used?
Okay, so well, I have a colleague who likes to describe data fusion as using one data set to enhance another data set, which is a very poetic way of describing a data science technique. But essentially, for example, if you've got a behavioural data set and you've got an attitudinal data set and you want to fuse those together to get a better understanding of who your customers are, what they're thinking, how they're behaving, a sort of general profiling exercise. On the whole, that's fine. If you're going beyond that to something that involves more advanced statistical techniques, we start to get into slightly more shaky ground. But then it also becomes quite unique to the individual data and the client organization as well. So for example, how much data you put into the modeling, how many variables you've been able to use in the profiling in order to create the fusion. and then of course how much risk as well the organisation is willing to accept, and some of that will be dictated around what kind of questions the organisation is making based on the data that's being modelled. So there's no hard and fast rule, but I think if it's going beyond profiling, I would be asking questions of your data science team around, how reliable it is, and what kind of caveats should be sort of in your thinking as you look at the results.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you so much, Fiona. A really nice yin yang of like the impact and important things that we have to consider, right? Because it's it isn't always easy, and there's lots of things which need to be considered. We hope you can join us. We've got 3 more webinars this week: Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We've got one tomorrow on the power of passive data and how that can be used to kind of get a more holistic understanding of our customers and consumers. We then have a session on Wednesday, which is all about digital personas, so understanding people's digital profile in order to kind of inspire communication. And then our very last session of the 12 webinars will be on Thursday, which is about keeping your finger on the pulse of the customer and consumer, because when we started this series, we were perhaps hoping that we'd be in a better place now, but it truly is, what are the ways that we can measure that temperature of our customer and consumer and how they're feeling, what they're thinking. So thank you ever so much. The recordings of these sessions will be online on the futureofresearch.ipsos.com link next week. So if you can't join us, do go and watch the recordings. Thank you.